All right, we're going to get started, folks. Thanks for coming out and braving the weather. I think this is actually an extraordinary turnout considering that despite this being a fairly modest snowstorm, they're canceling schools and closing shops and so forth. So I don't think anybody was prepared. So maybe you're here because you weren't prepared for the snow and you just didn't know how to change your schedules. But in any case, I thank you for coming. I want to thank a few people before we get started. Suzanne Stahl, who isn't here, but helped to arrange this and is doing this. At the same time, she's doing all the heavy lifting on the big conference that's happening this weekend, Professor Kaiser's conference that's happening this weekend. So if you don't already know about that, I suggest you come and ask a question or talk to Professor Kaiser or a number of other people here who know about the conference, because it's going to be great and you definitely ought to go. So this is I guess the third now in our series of climate policy presentations this semester. We're co-sponsoring this. I, by the way, am Josh Galpern. I'm the Associate Director of the Center for Environmental Law and Policy. At our last presentation, Bruce did the introduction and forgot to introduce himself. So now I'm looking over here and remembering that I should probably introduce myself. This is Bruce Ho. He's the Environmental Law and Policy Fellow at the Center for Environmental Law and Policy and has a few other titles associated with the law school, but I don't know them. So this is the third event in the series. We have one more event coming up after this. On December 4th, we're going to have Heidi Binko, who is a vice president at the Rockefeller Family Fund, and she oversees their climate funding and their climate program. So that should be really interesting. But first, we've got today's program. Now, we had intended this to be a conversation about regional perspectives on addressing climate change in regions where climate change is not a very salient political issue. And the two regions we had selected were the Midwest and the Southeast, two places where there are active groups working on addressing climate policy and climate change issues, but they're doing it in ways that are distinct from the ways that groups are working in, say, New England or California. Unfortunately, possibly because of the snow, possibly for other reasons, the southeastern side of this equation didn't make it tonight. So Steve Smith, who is from the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, is not able to be here, but we do have Dorothy Barnett, and I'm going to give Dorothy a quick introduction and let her talk more about herself. If any of you came and really wanted to know about what's going on in the Southeast, you're not going to get a presentation about that tonight, but I actually worked for Steve Smith and worked for the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy for several years. So as we get into sort of the question and answer session, I'm happy to try and answer some questions and sort of fill that voice, even though I'm obviously not the ideal voice for the Southeast of the United States. I may be able to fill a little bit of that gap. But we're going to have a really good discussion about what's going on in the Midwest, which has many of the similar problems. So this is Dorothy Barnett. Dorothy is the executive director of the Climate and Energy Project, based in Kansas, Lawrence, Kansas, I think, although doing work more broadly in the region. Dorothy is relatively new as the executive director, but has been with the Climate and Energy Project for a few years. She's worked on the HART program, which I believe is the Heartland Area Alliance for Regional Transmission. So has worked on the transmission side of energy. It does a lot of work on wind power, so the generation side of energy, and is one of the co-creators of the Take Charge Challenge, which is an energy efficiency challenge for municipalities and now also for commercial and industrial entities. So you'll hear more about all of this. The one other thing I learned, though, about Dorothy that I should mention is that you went to a Friends University. I went to a Friends High School. This is a Quaker school, so we have that in common. I did not know there was Quaker universities other than
in Wichita, Kansas.
And so it's not just the University of Pennsylvania. There's also Friends University. So without further ado, I'm going to let Dorothy get started, and she's going to give us a brief presentation. I've got some questions, so we're going to sort of try to do a discussion that way. I would have asked them the two people, but now we'll be a little briefer, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions from everybody else because we're half of the time we expected to take here. So thank you, and Dorothy, take it away.
Thank you so much for braving the snow. We're actually thrilled to see snow in Kansas last winter. We had none for the first time in a number of years. So thank you. I'm going to show you a short video clip to give you some context about the work that we do in Kansas and throughout the Heartland. We were actually fortunate. Lawrence Berkeley Labs came to Kansas last summer and did a short documentary about our work. And so this is a couple of people that I just wanted you to hear from.
there's a lot of talk about global warming, and to be honest with you, I almost think that it can be counterproductive, because the phrase global warming brings out so much passion in two different sides.
I'm not totally sold on the fact that fossil fuels are actually causing global warming. I think that's up to debate. However, I do believe that there is actual climate change going on. I believe that actually occurs naturally.
Our perspective is not so much worrying about whether man causes global warming, but more a matter of why don't we just make improvements that make sense economically, because there's so many of those types of improvements that can be made. Let's address the things that are easy to address first. Make environmental improvements that make sense economically for the frugal-minded Kansans that we are.
So again, thank you for inviting me today. I'm here today to share hope from the heartland. Evidence that a clean energy future in the United States is achievable in spite of politics or belief in climate change. You might think, how do I know? Because in 5 short years since the Climate and Energy Project has been in existence, we've been able to prove our theory, what we call Plan B, actually works. We went from having prominent legislators decrying wind energy as a pipe dream on the House floor to those same individuals now calling it a critical part of our energy mix and the fastest growing segment of our economy. When I started with CEP, there were about 64 megawatts of wind in Kansas. At the end of this year, we'll have over 3,000. So we've seen quite a substantial increase. In 2 short years, 22 Kansas communities with populations from 1,000 to 100,000 saved 28 million kilowatt hours of electricity. In those same 22 communities, volunteers gave more than 5,000 hours of their precious time to help their neighbors save energy. Because energy efficiency, as you all know, the least sexy and most important of our energy strategies, has found devotees across the state, from city managers, school superintendents, Chamber of Commerce presidents, farmers, ranchers, priests, and pastors, all of them pursuing energy efficiency for their own reasons, on their own terms, and influencing many others to do the same. Put differently, our mission is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in real time. And our means of doing so is building the foundation and the political will, we believe, for better policy. Great organizations all seem to have a great founding story. Ours is no different. Imagine it's Thanksgiving and you're at your in-laws' house. Not your parents' house for Thanksgiving, but your in-laws. Now imagine that your father-in-law is a hardcore environmentalist with an international reputation for activism. He's discussing with you, debating really, why with all the data, with all the information and science and the news coverage and Al Gore's PowerPoint, people in the heartland still don't believe in climate change. Why are there still climate deniers? And why aren't people changing their practices? They just don't get it. You make a simple assertion. We need to provide viable alternatives that are cost-effective and immediately available. We need to show and actually demonstrate a better future. Early in 2007, our founder, Nancy Jackson, met with Rick Reed of the Garfield Foundation, and he shared a concern with her that the U.S. could somehow manage to pass climate legislation, but fail to nurture a durable will to implement it. So for those of you who aren't new to this, think about 2007 and where we were in terms of the hope for cap and trade or for a renewable energy standard at the federal level. There were lots of ideas that perhaps we could pass climate legislation. We were concerned that, he was concerned that states might ignore the mandates and financial mechanisms like a carbon tax might fall prey to economic downturns and repeal or suspension, dooming the dependable emission reductions we were counting on. He was fairly insightful in 2007, based with the circumstances that we see now. Nancy's instincts and told her, and our focus groups and polls later confirmed, that there simply was not a demand for climate legislation in the heartland. So the question for us was, how do we build durable support? Some people seem to think that the path to better policy and social change is information. Most of us in this room are susceptible. Facts changed our minds. So more facts, better analysis, proper framing, and enough press attention should persuade the nation to act. We all know that there's plenty of data, there's plenty of modeling, there's plenty of smart framing on climate change. However, even before the climate counter movement, public opinion among conservatives in the heartland was headed the wrong way. Surveys consistently showed near unanimous skepticism about climate change in the Tea Party ranks. I'm sure you all saw the recent Frontline Climate of Doubt documentary. In that, Americans for Prosperity said, "We believe we won the debate in the heartland and that the debate is over on man-made global warming." When I started this presentation, I showed you a video of smart, passionate Kansans who care about their state, they care about their country, but they're questioning climate change. For us in our region, climate change is politically polarized. It was seen at the early and increasingly as a liberal issue, as an environmental issue, and people in the heartland do not consider themselves either liberal or environmentalist. So clearly, Plan A didn't work for us in the heartland. So how do we find common ground? Sorry, I've got my notes on the wrong page. So Plan B, we built durable relationships based on trust and common cause. We worked really hard to find out what mattered to Kansans. We talked to people, we worked with them. It wasn't about reframing for us. It really was about providing solutions based on our heartland values. We worked together to implement them. We celebrated the successes along the way. And it was really important to show the economic benefits. That was critical for us. Our skeptics don't trust models. They don't believe in jobs productions. And Missouri isn't called the show me state for nothing. We must be able to prove out what we propose, make energy efficiency and renewable energy default choices because they work, because they're cost effective, and because they build resilient local economies. So, what did we do in Kansas? We found little purchase for energy efficiency standard or for building codes with policymakers back when we started the Take Charge Challenge in 2009. We decided we would just start from scratch, and so we created a competition, an energy competition called the Take Charge Challenge. Knowing that our peers would influence people much better than we decided to harness the competitive spirit of Kansas communities and count on peer pressure to work. The Take Charge Challenge is a community-led competition designed to engage citizens in conversations about energy efficiency. The challenge encouraged homes and small businesses to change their mindset of efficiency as a sacrifice to we win. I'm happy to answer some questions about that a little bit later, but we've had some really great success and saved a lot of energy. As Josh mentioned, another area that we work in is HART, the Heartland Alliance for Regional Transmission. We all know that eventually fossil fuels will run out. As they do, prices will rise, they will become volatile. Kansas has the second best wind resource in the nation, but wind isn't perfect. There are two things about it. It's variable, and right now we need new transmission lines to carry our great Midwestern wind from the heartland to the east. So we created what we call the Heartland Alliance for Regional Transmission. It's a group of non-traditional stakeholders, mayors and county commissioners and landowners and economic development professionals, all coming together under a common cause of supporting wind energy and bringing more efficiency to the planning processes throughout our regional transmission organization, the Southwest Power Pool. This group has come together for a couple of years now, and they've created some materials really based on what their peers need to know about wind or transmission or efficiency, ways to get involved in advocacy, And this quarter and into the rest of next year, they'll be starting their own outreach in their own states. And so we're really excited about that process. The other thing that we're working on really has to do with climate change in big ways. The drought has severely impacted agriculture in our state and many others. And so we really wanted to make that connection with agriculture to be able to have them understand that there were opportunities that were perhaps being missed, but we needed to do that in a way that wasn't putting climate change out there in their face. And so we have created a pilot program on farm water and energy efficiency. And what we're doing is we are, with the help of a steering committee across the state in water, energy, and agriculture, we are having them identify innovation on farms in saving water and saving energy. And then we're going to be highlighting those folks as leaders and opportunity for others to emulate them. I'm looking forward to visiting with Josh about his questions and about your questions. What I really, would like to say is that from our perspective, it really doesn't have to be about climate change. We've managed to build some relationships. We've managed to reduce emissions in real time, and we are hopeful to be able to continue this important work. So, thank you.
Thank you. Well, I want to start with a question that doesn't directly address anything that was up in your presentation, but I think it's probably on everybody's mind, which is we had an election last night, which could be make a big difference in the future of climate. So I guess, how do you see this election playing into the work you do specifically in Kansas and the Midwest, and just more generally, how do you think this changes the prospects for climate legislation or other action?
We were in New York when the election happened, so we weren't even in Kansas. So I don't know what the response from local papers or from the folks back there will be. From our perspective, I'm thrilled that President Obama was reelected. From CEP's perspective, it really doesn't matter, because regardless of who's in office, what we've found is it's really the work on the ground that matters. I will say that we've had some success with our very conservative, very Republican governor, Sam Brownback. When he was Senator Brownback, he was one of 2 Democratic senators who voted for an RES, Renewable Energy Standard, out of his committee, Energy Environment Committee. And as governor, he's been good on energy. He frequently calls Kansas the renewable state, that he wants Kansas to be the renewable state. He publicly supports extending the production tax credit. We actually kicked off the second round of the Take Charge Challenge at the governor's mansion. It was the first event he held in office. I hope we have climate legislation. I think that's the way to go, but really from our perspective, we work across party lines.
So that to me is a real remarkable coup to be able to get somebody like Sam Brownback working affirmatively and cooperatively on he wouldn't put it this way, of course, but on climate change, on addressing climate change. So can you just fill us in sort of on sort of the trends and how that happened, and what role sort of activists or people in your position can play to make that happen?
Sure. And I will give all the credit in those first 3.5 years to our founder, Nancy Jackson. In case you all didn't recognize the name connotation, Wes Jackson is Nancy's father-in-law. And so that was the debate going on at the table. Wes, in case you don't know, runs the Land Institute in Salina, Kansas, on perennial agriculture, and named one of the top 100 people ever, I think. So Nancy spent a lot of time nurturing the relationship with Senator Brownback and his staff. We weren't certainly making constant trips to DC, but when he was in Kansas, we were normally in his office handing him some information about the economic value that wind energy could bring to Kansas. We were utilizing NRDC research and others to be able to say, here's what we're talking about with jobs. and he was, appealing to that. We did host a state fair booth, the Kansas State Fair. We had a giant wind turbine blade, and we signed postcards. We took 3,000 postcards from Kansans to Senator Brownback and Senator Roberts at that time in support of the federal renewable energy standard. And he listened. He understood that that was a good economic viability for Kansas. In terms of efficiency, whatever you may know about Senator Brownback, he's a very faithful man, and for him, conservation and efficiency is the right thing to do. It's taking care of what God's given us. And if you check out our website, you can actually see a video where he says that very thing. So we were able to nurture those relationships and get Kansans involved.
So have you had similar failures in trying to deal with politicians? I mean, that's such a good story. I wonder if there are things on the flip side where you've approached somebody and said, we've got this issue, this energy issue, and had pushback or just a complete brick wall or anything like that.
Unfortunately, we have. My own personal congressman in the city I live in is trying to purposefully roll back the production tax credit for wind energy. So he lives in, he represents the Big First, which many people would say that Big First district has the richest opportunity of any in the nation for wind production. It's in western Kansas, lots of flat land, lots of landowners wanting to lease up their land for wind turbines. He also plays host to a Siemens nacelle facility in his district. And his perspective is that the government should not be subsidizing any energy. And so we've had conversations in private and at town hall meetings. We've had advocates, members of our Heartland Alliance for Regional Transmission really have dug into the fossil fuel subsidies and have done some comparisons for him about some of those subsidies versus the wind subsidies. And he told a group of people at a town hall meeting that he doesn't really put much faith in the Congressional Budget Office numbers, which were the numbers we were presenting to him. And so, it's hard and it's difficult. What we see, though, is very moderate or moderate Republicans don't buy that argument. And so we think he won't last another 2 years.
And what is the messaging or the argument that the more moderate voters do buy? And not necessarily from a political perspective, maybe not from his angle, but from your angle, thinking of the projects you do, like Take Charge or Heart, what is the sort of messaging that you attach to those things that people can buy into that can make those successful?
It really, when we talk about Heartland values, it really is Heartland values. People in Kansas are much like they are in lots of places. Yes, they're conservative, but they think it's important to conserve their natural resources. That matters to them. A lot of the work we do are with farmers and with landowners, and they are the quintessential protectors in our region of land. That's their livelihood. They want to do what is best in that area. Faith has been a big deal. One of the projects that we started was a Kansas Interfaith Power and Light chapter in Kansas, and really that was churches all over the state reaching out, talking about creation care, talking about taking care of the earth, taking care of their fellow man, but doing it in the context of their faith, and that was a really important issue. So faith messages have been important. Really, jobs numbers have been a big deal. One of the projects that we did when we were first starting to explore opportunities for wind energy in Kansas, and that really has been an economic boon, by the way. In this year alone, there's been $3 billion invested in Kansas in wind energy. That's not the kind of numbers you hear from very many industries these days. So, but in the early days, we were looking at the supply chain and what opportunities there would be not only for wind farms, but what there would be for equipment to be built. And I mentioned the Siemens nacelle facility. That brought 400 jobs to the community I live in, which is a county of 60,000 people. 400 jobs in one fell swoop don't happen very often. Unfortunately, with the potential repeal of the production tax credit, there have been some substantial layoffs, and so those messages are the messages we use.
Let me go back to the faith messaging for a second, because this actually maybe is a good contrast with something that was happening in the Southeast, which is that messaging was a large part of trying to get climate action or other energy-related activism, and it actually ended up backfiring a little bit because there are several interfaith power and light groups in the Southeast, and they took up this mantle of creation care and similar faith-based talking points, and got a lot of pushback from more conservative faith groups saying you're phonies, you guys are no good. There was some Unitarian congregations involved in this, and they said, well, Unitarians, that's not faith, and it was a real controversy. They actually ended up turning off a lot of more conservative congregations, particularly in Tennessee. So I wonder, have you had that kind of tension, or has it worked out pretty well?
We didn't have that kind of tension, and in part, I think, because we went straight to the Catholics. I think that was a big part of it. There was a bishop in Kansas who really embraced wind energy, and he hosted several wind farm tours with priests across the region. There were sisters in different facilities that were engaged, and there's not a huge Unitarian population in Kansas, and so I don't even know for sure if there was one. There might have been one Unitarian church on the list, but mostly they were Catholic and Methodist and Episcopalian churches, and so we didn't have a lot of that pushback. I will say with that caveat, Interfaith Power and Light was not my project, it was my former colleague's project. And they have since split off from Climate and Energy Project, and they have their own director now and their own organization. And it's interesting because they've taken a slightly separate path since they've split from us, and they are actually a little more politically active than we ever were in that realm. And so we'll see how their first legislative session goes, which is coming up in January.
So it seems, and I could be wrong about this, so correct me if I am, that when you're talking about the idea of creation care, for instance, you set that up so that you can talk more explicitly about climate change. But I'm getting the sense that the bulk of your messaging is not climate change messaging. It's saving money, creating jobs, etc. So I guess the question is, are there places in your messaging where you actually do talk specifically or explicitly about climate change as opposed to the other benefits of this transition?
Rarely. We rarely do. And some people will say, what a cop-out. But it closes a lot of doors. I mean, if you walk into a room and you lead with climate change in this environment that we're in, people will not hear you. They won't work with you. We spent about 6 or 8 months last year trying to decide whether or not to change our name. When we started, it was okay to be the Climate and Energy Project. That was an okay thing to be. And it turned some people off. And they hear that and they say, oh, you're that enviro group. Oh, you're that liberal group. And so we've really had to concentrate on building those relationships with people, with our utility partners. And we call them partners because if we're going to get any work done in Kansas on efficiency, we have to have the utilities with us. We're a regulated state. Most of the states in the heartland are. And if you want to get work done, if you want better efficiency programs in businesses and for residents, you have to have the utilities support, or at least their cooperation. And so, there's at least 3 other reasons to do things than just climate change. So, we certainly are very upfront about our belief. We're very upfront about why we do the work we do. But we don't say, and you need to do it for climate change.
So something else that maybe you don't want to talk about too much publicly is you have to avoid climate change because it turns people off. But what you're doing is advocating for efficiency, energy efficiency, additional wind power, and what this is ultimately doing, and the reason it's ultimately benefiting the climate situation is because you're reducing the reliance on coal power, which I know is still a huge problem in Kansas like everywhere else. So I guess the question is, how much do you then talk about why wind or why efficiency actually make this impact, about actually taking coal off the grid? How much of that is part of your messaging, and how do you manage to talk about creating jobs on one side but sort of reducing jobs on the other side?
Our organization started in part because they were trying to build a coal plant in western Kansas. And so, the idea initially was, we've got to do something about that coal plant. I can say in all honesty, that was before my day. I wasn't on board when they were fighting the coal plant. I came just a little bit after that. It became apparent very quickly that in our state, you can't just be against something to get work done. You have to be for something. And so for us, we were for wind, we were for efficiency, and we let others be the bulldog on no coal. And that's still a really stinging issue for a lot of organizations and a lot of people. That coal plant is not built in western Kansas. It's still in litigation, not with us. We're not the litigators. But last year in the legislature, there was a fairly hard attempt to repeal our renewable energy standard, our renewable portfolio standard that we have in Kansas. And it was directly tied to, you environmentalists said, if you got your RPS, you'd let us have the coal plant. Now, that's not what was happened, but that was the perception. And so, so they're still tied. But that's not, that's not the role that we play.
Are there people in Kansas who are pro-coal and anti-wind, or has it by and large become pro-wind across the board in that region?
Kansas is a very pro-wind state. I think at our last polls, it was about 87% were for wind energy. And so, yes, what most of the time you will find is we're an all of the above state. I mean, that's what you'll hear almost everywhere. You'll hear it at the top, and you'll hear it from people on the street. We're an all of the above. People are starting to get the message that there are bad things about coal, but it still is not very prevalent, and most of the time they think it is just a bunch of rhetoric that those liberal environmentalists are making up.
And so you've now said you've got 3,000 megawatts of wind online, so that's...
We will at the end of the year.
That's like 3 big coal plants.
It is.
And how many coal plants online in that same time period? Do you have any idea?
0.
0.
Yeah.
So that's good news.
It is. It is. It is.
So let me sort of expand to the region, the Midwest,
Sure.
More broadly, and this may be a question that you don't have a lot of details for, but it's a big region, and you guys are based in, of course, in Kansas, but you do some work in other parts of the region. Do you find that you have to tailor your messaging or your strategies differently in different parts of one state or throughout the region as a whole, or is the same messaging work largely across the whole region?
Our messaging is pretty consistent across the region, but what we have found, and that's where HART, the Heartland Alliance for Regional Transmission, comes in, it really isn't our messaging that we go into other states with. People know us in Kansas, we've been there, we're based there, but in the other states and around the region, we're not as well known. And so the work still needs to be done there. That's still our regional transmission organization, which is kind of the boundaries that we put in. But it's those stakeholders from those states that are the messengers, and that's kind of maybe the key takeaway is having those people on the ground in their states is what matters. And so they're the ones that are talking about the value of wind for their state, or they're the ones that are talking about efficiency and how it might work in their state.
And it sounds like these non-traditional partnerships and non-traditional spokespersons are a great boon for getting the message out there without having the Climate and Energy Project
Right.
be at the front and therefore be at risk of creating some sort of political backlash. So can you tell us a little more about HEART and about the Take Charge Challenge and how these partnerships work and how you get them established in the first place? Because it seems to me that that's a big challenge, convincing a utility or a big employer that they should be on board with this sort of thing.
So when we started the residential Take Charge Challenge, it really was about going to our utilities who knew us, that we had worked with on other projects before, and saying, hey, we have this idea. You want to get your efficiency programs out there. We want to get people to start talking and taking advantage of energy efficiency. Can we partner? Can we work together? It helped that at that particular time we weren't asking them for money. It was a project that we had already funded, and so we weren't asking them for money. We were just asking for their time, and it was beneficial for them. Those utilities at that time in 2009 really didn't have relationships with their consumers. It was, that horrible utility. And so this gave them an opportunity to talk to people. It gave us an opportunity to really make them champions for energy efficiency. And our reason for doing that was very clear. We knew that we wanted to go to our corporation commission and talk about energy efficiency. And it's awfully difficult for utilities to be all year long in the press, in front of their customers, talking about how good the Take Charge Challenge was, how great efficiency was, and then go to the Corporation Commission and say, oh, but that's not a good idea. So we had our reasons for doing it. They had their reasons for joining, but it worked very well together. So that was one way with the Take Charge Challenge. We are expanding that challenge to a Heartland challenge, and we're changing it from just residential. It's going to be a business challenge. And I wish I could tell you how well it's going, but we're just getting started. We have commitments from the utility partners and some big businesses in Kansas, Hallmark, Sprint, Burns & McDonald, and some others that we are going to have as model businesses. They've done a good job with efficiency, and so they're going to share their knowledge and expertise. It's going to be a business competition in 4 states with 8 cities. This time the utilities are on the hook for a prize. And so because we've had the reputation with the Kansas City Power and Light and the West Stars that we've worked with in the past, they're our spokespeople in other states, and they're able to say to OG&E in Oklahoma, yeah, they're a pretty good group. Go ahead and work with them. You can trust them.
Are the utilities the good guys or the bad guys in your region? I think it varies region to region how people see their utilities, and it depends on things like rates or how many outages there are, or how quickly you can recover from an outage. Obviously, we've had some sort of back and forth with the utilities here lately. I understand in Bridgeport they were throwing rotten vegetables at line workers, but so what is it like for you guys?
It depends on who you ask, but in Kansas rates are low. 8.5, 9 cents a kilowatt hour, so that we have low rates. The utilities are accessible. You can see them, you can talk with them, you can work with them. We don't always see eye to eye on what they should be getting rate recovery for or how much, but we are able to at least have a dialogue and have conversations. Outages we don't have a ton. In Kansas, they're pretty fast about, if there's a tornado that takes down some lines, they're pretty fast about getting us back online. Of late, there's been some talk about decoupling, and that has gotten people a little nervous, and they're not as excited about that. The utilities are pushing back on that a little bit.
Do you want to explain a little more about decoupling? I know it's a complicated subject matter, so we don't need to get into too much detail.
So decoupling is divorcing the amount of energy that they use from the rates. And so utilities have a set cost that they need to recover for their lines or for different things. And decoupling is separating that from how much energy they sell. And so they'll be allowed to spread out that fixed cost, and it's not based on what the rate is. And there's some pros and cons for that. Some people think it's a good thing, some people think it's not. That's kind of been the thing that people have been talking about in more detail, particularly for the gas companies. As you all know, natural gas prices have gone to very low, and so our natural gas companies in Kansas are having a hard time even recovering their fixed costs because they're so low, and so that's kind of where the decoupling conversations have kind of been.
So it's not driven by energy efficiency.
It is not at this point driven by energy efficiency.
That's too bad.
Yeah, it is.
So I just have a couple more questions, and then I'll turn it over to the audience here. So you said it was okay at one point 5 years ago to be the Climate and Energy Project, and that's obviously become a little more touchy. Mm-hmm. I'm curious about the sort of the discussion there, if you would tell us about that, and why you decided to stick with it, and if you think that maybe in the not too distant future it will be okay to be the Climate and Energy Project again.
I think there were two things at play. In the early days, I don't think we knew any better. We didn't really have a sense of how difficult it was going to be the Climate and Energy Project when things first got started. In recent days, in Kansas, we were able to develop relationships enough and respect, and people knew us, so it wasn't doors getting shut in our face. But as we started to spread out and talk to new utility partners or talk to new public utility commissioners for that matter, that name was a hindrance. We also were going through kind of some internal transition, and so there was a lot of talk about, is there value in switching? We actually had chosen a new name and a new identity. It was Energy Progress, and we had a great tagline: jobs, prosperity, security. But we really have built up some capital with our climate and energy name. You saw some quotes from the New York Times. When we first started the Take Charge Challenge, we had a front page story on the New York Times. That's a pretty big deal for a tiny nonprofit from Kansas. We had some exposure from Lawrence Berkeley Labs with some reports that they've done, with some documentaries. We actually, on Earth Day this year, some of you may have seen, may be familiar with Earth, the Operator's Manual. They have a 3-series documentary. The second in the series is called Energy Quest USA, and the Take Charge Challenge is one of 5 that's featured on that. So we really looked at that exposure and the capital that we built up within our own state and among our peer network across the nation, and really felt like there were not the benefits to outweigh having to rebrand and do all those things.
And that's a good segue into my last question, which is about the funding situation for a group like yours. It's always more difficult than you'd like it to be, obviously. Sure. Is it harder being a small group in Kansas than it might be being in New England, or do you find that you stand out more? Where does your funding largely come from,
Sure.
regionally, or how does that? What does the landscape there look like?
When Josh introduced me, he told you I was relatively new to the executive director position. I've been doing it just about a year. Before that, I was the director of energy and transmission, so I'm a little geeky on the transmission and energy side, and I'm really just trying to get my feet wet and wrap my mind around the fundraising side. Most of our funding is from private foundations, many of it from funders on the East Coast. We get funds from CERDNA, we get funds from the Rockefeller Brothers, we get funds from New York Community Trust. One of our big funders is the Kresge Foundation. They fund our work in the Southwest Power Pool. We have some West Coast funding through the Energy Foundation. We've been the recipient of a Department of Energy grant that was what started our HEART program. And so it's kind of varied. Unfortunately, when funders say we fund the Midwest, what they're really talking about is they fund the upper Midwest, anything from Nebraska north. And so Kansas down is kind of a black hole for funders. When they want to fund regionally, it's usually upper Midwest. it has gotten more difficult in the last few years to raise funds for the work that we're doing. The funders seem to appreciate the work we're doing, they seem to understand it, but many of our funders are starting to make a shift from policy to adaptation. And they're starting to be most concerned with how do we help urban areas when climate change happens and when those effects impact them. So that's the funding that they want to fund. That's what they want to do. Our assertion is that if you don't have the Midwest, where we're the highest emitters, where we have the greatest opportunity for renewables, you lose. You need us. And so that's the message that we try to put forth to our funders. It's a challenge every day. And so
Did you tell them the Sam Brownback story?
I have told the Sam Brownback story a lot, and they're very happy that we're able to make those strides, but they're not opening their checkbooks for that. So it is difficult.
Yeah.
It is.
Well, great. Well, thank you very much. So I want to turn it over if there are other questions here.
Do you get any funding from the wind industry?
The wind industry, we do not. No.
Consider trying to do that, considering that you're basically helping them?
We have partnered with AWEA, the American Wind Energy Association, for wind belt tours. So things like when we've gone to different cities to talk about wind, we've let them fund that work. We really have a policy to not take industry money. We also don't take money from the utilities. Now, we'll let the utilities fund the prize to their businesses for the competition, but that money's not going to us. So no, we don't get money from the wind industry. And given the circumstances that many of them are in with the production tax credit, I'm not sure that they would have a whole lot to give at this point. But at this point, we don't. I hope that we won't have to.
To what extent do you think public perception of climate change has been affected by some of the extreme weather events that we've seen over the last year, including the drought? Does that do some of your work for you without having to use the words climate change?
It does some. It does some. We're hopeful that our on-farm water and energy efficiency pilot is going to get some traction and at least open the doors for dialogue to be able to talk about why it's happening. But in our region, you at least have to first start the conversation somewhere. Part of our work with that will be to look at some policies across the state, water policies, energy policies, and our hope is that we'll be able to connect some dots for people in a way that isn't an in-your-face, overt. We've had some success with those types of kind of policy down and grassroots up work before, so that's what we're gonna try to do here.
One of the things I found most interesting about just the few slides that you showed was, I think it was a quote from the New York Times saying how it's become a part of the cultural identity of the heartland to be, not believing in climate change or something like that. And then you also talked a little bit about how it's most effective to have people on the ground in the states, from those states, working on this stuff. So I was just wondering, just to sort of just phrase that as a question, how important to your model and to your success is it that these are Kansans helping Kansans or Wisconsins helping Wisconsins, and also would people shut off if it were people from the Northeast or from the West Coast?
It's really important. I mean, that's kind of been key. In the Take Charge Challenge, one of the things I didn't talk about was we didn't swoop in as an organization into these 16 cities and say, yay, let's do energy efficiency. We got together a leadership team, and it was the mayor, and it was the county commissioner, and it was the school superintendent, and the coach that everybody loved, and the chamber, and they were the ones that were planning the strategy for that community. We were there to provide assistance. We had some part-time staff who was helping to organize meetings and events, but really it was all about what worked for them. And so that, I think, was key to the success of the Take Charge Challenge. And we're doing that in the business challenge now. You know, it's those model businesses, it's the utility, it's the chambers, it's the sustainability organizations, whatever they might be, or the sustainability coordinators in those communities, but it's their project. And so getting them to have that buy-in, I think has been really successful. With the Heartland Alliance for Regional Transmission, you know, it's such a varied and diverse group. You know, landowners are there for one reason. The economic development professionals are there for another reason. The clean energy advocates are there for another reason. But ultimately, they all want the same thing for whatever reason. And so having them in each of their networks be more educated and more interested and active, we think is what will be most successful. They are just starting their state outreach. I can tell you, we took, I think there were 27 stakeholders to a Southwest Power Pool board meeting. We had a face-to-face meeting, and then the next day was the Southwest Power Pool board meeting. They wanted to go, they wanted to see what it was like. And I gotta tell you, you walked in there with this big group of people, and you have to pass a microphone around the room, and everybody has to introduce themselves. And so every time somebody said, I'm with HART, I'm with the Heartland Alliance for Regional Transmission, you know, people's heads started to turn and their eyes got big, and they started saying, who is this group, and what are they doing here, and what do they want? And really, I mean, we were just stakeholders that were interested in the process, and it was so foreign to them that a group of people like this would volunteer their time to come to a meeting and be engaged in that process. I think so much more of that needs to happen all across the country if we're going to make some real change.
As a compliment to the challenge program, have you been doing any benchmarking?
A little, not as much as we'd like to. We have a really small staff, as I mentioned. We work with 2 consultants, 2 part-time staff, and me. And we're working in 4 states, and so the benchmarking is not what it needs to be. My newest hire has a background in some of that information, and so she's helping us to design a little bit, but I'd be thrilled to have any suggestions you have on the best way to do that.
Doing something like that, fee for service type of.
We have not. So, okay.
Other questions?
I'm wondering, coming out of the behaving context, about how much part of our stuckness around climate change isn't because there's conservatives or media or corporations, but because people care about it or know about it, aren't active, aren't really taking strides, really changing their lives, aren't coming to protests, aren't turning out. I mean, New Haven is very quiet on climate change. And there are a lot of people here and a lot of environmental organizations that are concerned or really haven't changed their behaviors much. We have a protest around 350 in New Haven, there's 6 people. And it's really a very quiet time culturally. And so I wonder how much the work needs to be internal more than external in the organizations that care about sustainability and environmental issues, and really have discussions with our own boards and volunteers and members about the crisis we're facing. Because I don't get the sense in organizations that people are taking this seriously. And in part, I think, you know, like the civil rights movement, people did pretty radical things, which a lot of people said, oh, it's not going to be effective, that's crazy, Mississippi will never turn, or whatever. But it was because of those inspiring actions that people were motivated in some ways to take risks and do other things and look at their own lives. And that's not happening in the U.S. right now in any serious way. So I don't know if those discussions are happening in Kansas within the organizations and people's own lifestyles and making choices, because part of that's the momentum.
Right.
And we see 3 bikers a day biking.
Right.
You know, if all the environmental folks would say, we're just going to do this, I mean, but that's not happening.
In the Heartland and in Kansas, there are not a lot of environmental organizations, period. Not very many doing this work. Part of our hope with HART has been to pull in some of those other voices, and we're starting to do that more. We work with some folks from the Center for Rural Affairs in Nebraska, Oklahoma Sustainability Network in Oklahoma, Missouri Energy Efficiency Association in Missouri. But collectively, so much of the time, I think we're just trying to keep our heads above water with our own programs. So part of our mission and goal is trying to reach out to those others. We think that the challenge has given people a reason to take some action, and we've seen that with things that they're actually doing and changes they're actually making in their homes. For us, there has to be a reason. People have to have a reason to do it because, again, they're not going to just walk in and say, I think climate change is important. And so we've given them competition as a reason to make some changes. But I agree. I mean, I think we're kind of in this weird space where so much money has been spent to fill that climate science void or confusion, and so trying to figure out how you get out of that. We think it's personal connections and it's people to people talking over the mailbox about things that they need to do for whatever their reason happens to be.
Anybody else?
Well, can you tell us about the Southeast?
That's for me, I guess.
Yeah.
Yes, that's good.
Well, I think the story is very much the same in the Southeast. Climate messaging doesn't work, but the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, the group that I worked for and Steve Smith runs, who would have been here, has sort of a bifurcated strategy. In the actual on-the-ground practical programs that they carry out, they do very much similar things to what's happening in Kansas. There's a lot of energy efficiency efforts that the messaging is it saves you money. It's a cheap resource. It's cheaper than building a new nuclear reactor, which is what's happening in the Southeast. Why spend $4 to $20 billion to build a nuclear reactor when you can put a couple million into energy efficiency and get much better returns and actually maybe get it done, which isn't happening for nuclear reactors. So there's the economic argument. The economic argument that when you build new generation, whether it's a nuclear reactor or a coal plant, that's going to raise rates, and people can talk about coal and nukes being cheap, but it still costs a lot of money to build them, and that's an important thing for people to understand. So this kind of messaging goes on a lot in the actual programs, but in the outreach materials, there still actually is a lot of talk about climate change. In the blog, which is very active for the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, the press releases, things like this, climate actually is still very much part of a message, and I think that's a vestige of the executive director who he came of age in a very strong activism and grew up in a time where chaining yourself to things was the way to get things done, and so it's hard for him as a person to give up the very direct messaging, but practically speaking, the work that's being done the messaging is changing dramatically. So we fight coal plants not because of their climate impacts, but because of their human health impacts. It's not about the carbon that's coming out. It's about the particulate matter and the mercury and the coal ash. Nuclear reactors, it's because they're expensive and they don't make sense to build. And renewable energy because it creates jobs and it's a new opportunity for growth of new industries in the Southeast. So I think it's very similar. We have had no luck down there with politicians whatsoever, and I think that's because Governor Brownback and others see that there is money, tax money, to be made in the wind industry. The Southeast does not have the same natural resources for this sort of thing, neither wind nor solar. But the Southeast, somebody has called the Midwest the Saudi Arabia of wind, and we have been calling the Southeast the Saudi Arabia of energy efficiency, because people have very low rates down there, some of the lowest in the country for some of the states, Tennessee in particular, because of the Tennessee Valley Authority. And these low rates allow people to use extraordinary amounts of electricity without being concerned for their overall bill. But they could dramatically reduce energy usage, pay still a lot less, and there's just tons of space for that kind of efficiency and reduction in use. Except in the state of Alabama, which they are constantly told that they have extraordinarily low rates. They actually have the third highest rates in the entire country. They have the third highest bills in the entire country. Their rates are middle for the country, although they are high for the Southeast. Only Florida and Florida and maybe Louisiana maybe have higher rates, but they spend an extraordinary amount on their bills. They're behind Hawaii and I think New Jersey in their actual, what they pay in their actual bills. And the reason is because they're largely being lied to by the utilities about how little they're paying. And they keep saying to themselves, oh, we're not paying anything. So there's a real information gap. And I think that's true in energy in general. That's not unique to the Southeast. But I think, as you say, it's a cultural piece of this is cultural, and there's a lot of cultural pride in the Southeast about our electricity is cheap, we love coal, and that's why it's cheap, we don't have to worry about it. And people are unwilling to learn that actually their electricity is not cheap because of coal, that it's been increasing, and they're actually paying a lot more in their bills because they're not willing to sort of take those next steps. But I think the take-home message is it's not that different. It's not that different.
We think the real opportunity in the Southwest Power Pool and an area that we're working on is in demand response. And so lots of opportunities. There's lots and lots of smart meters happening in the heartland. And so trying to engage people at the Southwest Power Pool at our transmission organization to think about the rules that might impede demand response or energy efficiency and ways to make those better. And so we think there's a lot of opportunity for that too that we're just really starting to touch on. So.
You can see either Southeast or Midwest, in the Southern Midwest, a trajectory that's where this kind of work is going in a direction. We're at 20% by 2020 or 80% by 2050, or is it just, you just don't get the traction to really make that kind of at this point in time?
Things are moving in the right direction, I think. There's definitely momentum. 20 by 20 or 80 by 2050. Coal retirement is happening at a very rapid rate in the Southeast and in the Midwest and across the country. So there is absolutely a possibility that could happen because coal is coming offline so quickly and is going to be replaced one way or the other with something less carbon intensive. Wind, efficiency, solar, natural gas, which obviously has its own issues, but by and large is less carbon intensive. So I think we're moving very quickly in that direction, but I don't know how much coal is going to come offline and then what happens next, because the economics are in favor of coal shutting down. But I don't know if the economics are quite there yet for that next more difficult step. But retiring coal 10 years ago seemed very unlikely when President Bush was talking about doubling the country's, that's a number, I don't think he wanted to double it, but dramatically increasing the country's coal capacity, and here we are seeing it dramatically decrease. So things change.
Well, and you know, you heard me say when we started there were 64 megawatts of wind in Kansas. At the end of this year, we'll be over 3,000. Kansas actually gets almost 8% of our own electricity we generate from wind. That puts us up in the top 5. So that's a big deal. You know, we think that there has been a lot of work done on the clean energy transmission grid, kind of in some thought processes and some planning. If we're ever really going to reach 20% or others, there's got to be some work on the transmission grid. And we've got to be able to do some interconnections from the east to the west and Texas and others. And so change is happening. What would speed it up is a federal renewable energy standard. If we could get at the federal level for them to say, here it is, we're doing this, you would see exponential growth. So
There's just a report out from Price Waterhouse. I don't know if you saw, but they basically said they're, based on what's happening, that they fully expect 6 degrees Celsius increase by 2100. And carbon assets will be stranded, quotes, that cannot be business as usual. This is a report for business folks about climate change. It's pretty strong.
I haven't seen it.
And they're saying it's not about politics, it's just pure math. And if you're investing in carbon-intensive stuff, you should be careful.
Right.
You're investing in anything. You're investing in anything that relies on weather patterns that are recognizable and water being available. It's a scary investment to make.
This could be totally off the mark, but much has been written and filmed about kind of the unfortunate financial dependence that a lot of Midwestern farmers have on large agro industries and things like that. And it seems to me like leasing out farmland for wind production could provide a little bit of financial dependence for people. So have you found any of those corporations making their way, sticking their nose into your business or providing resistance to your work, or is that not something that they're doing?
Not at this point. There's such huge support from landowners for wind, and it's really an opportunity for them to diversify. And so we haven't gotten that. Where we get the pushback from agriculture is if we start really putting climate change in their face. I was telling Josh that 3 years ago we hosted a professor from University of Tennessee, and we put on a forum how agriculture could thrive in a low carbon economy. I mean, it was in February of 2009. We fully expected that was the direction we were going to go, and we had all the commodity groups there. We had big ag, we had small, we had landowners. It was very successful. Good conversations about what direction they could take, and then it kind of just fell off a cliff. And so we've now started to try to make our way back into the conversations with ag again about energy practices as it relates to water, because that's something that is impacting them right now that they're willing to talk about. But it's interesting. You know, we have Farm Bureau, and we have Farmers Union, and we have both of the presidents of those on our steering committee. And that's a real diverse group of conversation. You know, what one thinks is good, the other doesn't really. So trying to come to some consensus and some common ground with those groups has been interesting. But at this point, we have not had pushback from big ag.
In the event of a federal decision, what do you think the future of your nonprofit is?
I think that if a federal renewable energy standard were to be passed, we probably wouldn't have to do much of anything on wind. I mean, it's going to go forward. There's still a lot of work to be done on efficiency, and there's still a lot of work to be done on demand response. People really don't think about their energy use. You know, they don't. When we first started this work and we were polling Kansans and doing some focus groups, a lot of people thought most of our energy came from solar. I mean, it was just not a talking point. I mean, they don't think about it. They don't talk about it. Which for me, and for my young daughter here who listens to me talk about energy all of the time, it's hard to fathom. But that's a reality. It's cheap. It's there every day. You flip on the light and it's there. So people don't really think about energy use. And so, you know, we think there's always going to be a place for people to talk about smart uses of energy.
Just in terms of energy efficiency and the supply side of the glorious wind energy, and do you find it actually harder to promote energy efficiency and do behavioral change rather than be on let's build wind and it's fabulous energy? So I think there's a lot to begin from energy efficiency, but then it's harder in terms of infrastructure and also investment as well.
It is difficult. I mean, it's not the sexy thing. You can't see the jobs that are created from it. We have low rates, so people don't really, you know, they're not going to save, even if they save 30%, you know, that's maybe $100 a year. So it's not, you're not talking about big dollars for people. And so we talk about it in the context of fun, competition, encouraging people to do something good for themselves, for their neighbors, help their community win a prize. That's been one way that we've addressed it. You know, I say that our rates are low, and they are, comparatively speaking, but they are going up, and so we're starting to try to have conversations at our corporation commissions, our public utility commission levels, as the utilities are going in to ask for retrofits of coal plants. You know, we're beginning to intervene on policy to be able to ask the question, you know, why aren't we considering efficiency? It's much lower cost. Here's opportunities. You know, the issue with efficiency from a utility perspective is it's got to be something they can depend on. And so they're nervous about efficiency and using that to meet the same type of of load that they could get otherwise from other sources. And so it's a balancing act, trying to keep it in front of people, making sure people don't have that Jimmy Carter in a sweater, I'm freezing, mantra. There's lots of things they can do and still be comfortable. And so that's been our message for efficiency. But it's harder than it is with wind. There's no doubt about it.
Okay, well, thank you guys very much for coming.